Inside the Vatican Bank, they call it the Bank of God, a sacred vault built to serve faith itself. But behind the marble walls of the Vatican, far from the eyes of the ordinary believer, another current flowed, one of secrecy, money, and unimaginable power. What began as an institution for charity quietly transformed into one of the world's most mysterious financial fortresses. Diplomats, cardinals, and politicians passed envelopes that held more than blessings. Whispers moved through Rome in the late 20th century. Missing millions, coded accounts, and silent men who knew too much. A handful of investigators who came too close either vanished, resigned, or met strange ends. The church denied, deflected, and moved on, yet the smell of smoke never left the holy air. This is not a tale of rumor. It is a documented descent of faith into finance, of holiness entangled with greed, of God's banker who paid the price for knowing too much. Beneath the domes and crosses that touch the sky lies a truth money could not cleanse. The Holy Bank of Secrets. In the closing years of the Second World War, while Europe burned and empires fell, a new kind of power was quietly taking shape inside the Vatican walls. In 1942, under Pope Pius XII, the Institute for the Works of Religion was born. To the faithful, it was the church's treasury for good works. A bank created to fund missions, maintain churches, and protect assets threatened by the chaos of war. Yet from the moment of its creation, the Vatican Bank was unlike any other institution on earth. It was sovereign, secret, and untouchable. Unlike commercial banks, it answered to no government, no auditor, and no outside law. It operated under the shield of Vatican sovereignty, a privilege that allowed billions to flow across borders without scrutiny. At its head sat men of the cloth who dressed in humility, but managed fortunes larger than nations. In the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica, a quiet financial empire began to rise. After the war, Europe was rebuilding, and the Vatican positioned itself as both moral authority and silent banker. Gold from wartime accounts, donations from around the world, and assets from Italy's wealthiest families began to move through its vaults. Some historians believe certain funds, tainted by war and collaboration, were quietly absorbed, relics of an era when survival demanded silence. The Vatican's neutrality during the war had given it unique access to routes of money others could not touch. By the 1950s and 1960s, Italy's new republic was unstable, plagued by corruption, political conflict, and a growing fear of communism. The Vatican Bank became a discreet channel for money meant to influence politics. Funds moving through charities, religious orders, and front organizations that advanced Western interests. As the Cold War deepened, the Church's moral crusade against communism conveniently aligned with the financial interests of Western intelligence networks. Through this alliance, faith and geopolitics became inseparable. Yet for all its holy purpose, whispers inside Rome grew louder. Officials noticed how money vanished between accounts, how offshore companies in Panama, Luxembourg, and Switzerland seemed to link back to Vatican signatures. It was the beginning of a system where sacred funds and secret operations shared the same corridors. Few outside the Vatican understood how vast or how dangerous this financial structure had become. The Holy Bank was no longer just managing the wealth of the Church. It was feeding a network that reached deep into the political and criminal veins of Europe. Every deposit, every transfer carried the weight of both devotion and deception. And somewhere within those golden ledgers, the seeds of the greatest church scandal in modern history had already been sown. The Brotherhood of Shadows. By the 1970s, Italy had become a chessboard of power, a nation trapped between democracy and disorder, where the church, the mafia, and the state quietly shared the same table. Behind the walls of the Vatican, men spoke of faith and redemption by day, but by night, they managed accounts that connected to men who answered to no God. The Institute for the Works of Religion, still shielded by Vatican sovereignty, became the perfect place to move money that could never see the light of day. At the center of this growing labyrinth stood a network few dared to name aloud, Propaganda 2, or simply P2. Officially, it was a Masonic lodge. In reality, it was a secret brotherhood of politicians, intelligence officers, bankers, and military figures who sought to reshape Italy's power structure from within. Its members included senior officials, ministers, and even journalists. Their goal was control, and the Vatican Bank became one of their most valuable instruments. The man who bridged these worlds was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, an American prelate who rose to head the Vatican Bank in 1971. Charismatic and bold, Marcinkus had earned the trust of Pope Paul VI and later John Paul II. But his alliances reached far beyond the church. He forged a powerful partnership with Roberto Calvi, the ambitious head of Banco Ambrosiano, a private Italian bank that would soon become inseparable from the Vatican's own financial empire. Through Marcinkus and Calvi, Vatican accounts were tied to offshore companies in Panama, the Bahamas, and Luxembourg. These shell firms concealed the transfer of hundreds of millions, money that funded covert operations, anti-communist activities, and, as later evidence suggested, organized crime. Mafia bosses laundered their profits through the same channels used by clerics and politicians. Each transaction was sanctified by the Vatican's diplomatic immunity. No Italian authority could inspect the books of God's bank. In this shadow alliance, everyone benefited. The Vatican gained influence and political leverage. The mafia cleaned their dirty money. Intelligence agencies used the same routes to finance operations in Latin America, where Catholic organizations served as fronts for Cold War funding. The Church's moral shield had become the perfect cover for a network that thrived on secrecy. But power built in darkness cannot stand forever. By the end of the decade, internal leaks began to surface. Journalists received fragments of evidence, coded ledgers, and testimony from frightened insiders. Calvi, Marcinkus, and the P2 leadership were drawn into a tightening circle of suspicion. The lines between church crime and state were no longer blurred. They were fused. Within the Vatican, whispers grew louder. That money meant for missions had vanished. That priests were being paid to remain silent. That one day, this invisible brotherhood would destroy everything it had built. Few understood how close that day truly was. The fall of God's banker. London, June 1982. The city was still asleep when a security guard walking along the Thames made a discovery that would send shockwaves through Europe. Hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge was the body of a man dressed in an expensive suit, his pockets filled with bricks, and £15,000 in cash tucked neatly inside his coat. His name was Roberto Calvi, chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, one of Italy's most powerful banks, and the Vatican's closest financial partner. To the world, Calvi had been a respected banker, nicknamed God's banker for his deep ties to the Vatican. But behind that title lay a man entangled in webs of fraud, political manipulation, and secret brotherhoods. Just days before his death, Calvi had fled Italy disguised, carrying false documents. He feared for his life, and for good reason. His empire was collapsing, and with it, the Vatican's secret financial network was on the brink of exposure. The scandal began when investigators discovered billions of lire missing from Banco Ambrosiano's accounts. The Vatican Bank, under Archbishop Marcinkus, had guaranteed many of Calvi's offshore loans. When the money disappeared, suspicion turned to the Vatican itself. Calvi tried to warn his contacts, claiming that if he fell, others in far higher places would fall with him. Letters found later revealed that he feared assassination disguised as suicide. When his body was found, the symbolism was haunting. Blackfriars Bridge, a name linked to the dark robes of Masonic Blackfriars, seemed almost too fitting. Calvi was a known member of the P2 Masonic Lodge, whose influence stretched into Italian politics, intelligence, and the church. To investigators, the location was a message, a silent ritual of betrayal and punishment. Initially, authorities called it suicide, but the evidence disagreed. Forensic experts later proved Calvi couldn't have hung himself. The knots, the height, the positioning of the body all pointed to murder. His family and much of the world believed he had been silenced, executed by the same network he once served. In Italy, the fallout was immediate. Banco Ambrosiano collapsed, thousands lost their savings, and questions turned to the Vatican Bank's role. The Institute for the Works of Religion denied involvement, yet it quietly paid hundreds of millions in moral restitution. Marcinkus, protected by Vatican immunity, was shielded from prosecution. Italian authorities could not touch him inside the walls of the Holy See, but the damage was irreversible. The world had seen the Church's most sacred institution entangled in money laundering, organized crime, and mysterious death that smelled of conspiracy. Faith was shaken. The Vatican's image of purity and divine trust had been pierced by scandal and shadow. And though the Vatican would later claim reform, the truth of Roberto Calvi's death remained buried beneath layers of silence, secrecy, and sin. His hanging body beneath the bridge stood as a symbol, not a suicide, but how power devours even its most loyal servants. The cover-up and the consequences. After Roberto Calvi's body was cut down from Blackfriars Bridge, the investigation that followed became less about justice and more about protection. The Vatican, Italy's government, and secret organizations all scrambled to contain the fallout. Each had something to lose if the full truth came to light. Inside the Vatican, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus remained calm and defiant. Shielded by Vatican sovereignty, he refused to testify before Italian prosecutors. When warrants were issued for his arrest, he simply stayed within Vatican walls, beyond the reach of any foreign law. "You can't indict the Church of God," one official remarked, and for years that seemed true. Marcinkus kept his title, his office, and his silence. Meanwhile, Banco Ambrosiano's collapse destroyed lives across Italy. Thousands of investors were ruined, and government officials faced humiliating questions about how billions had been funneled offshore through church-linked accounts. Yet those who tried to follow the money soon found the trail vanished into a web of numbered accounts, offshore shells, and destroyed documents. Witnesses who might have explained it all began to die. Suddenly, strangely, bankers connected to the scandal turned up dead in apparent suicides. One auditor, who promised to deliver proof of high-level Vatican involvement, was found shot in his car before he could testify. Evidence disappeared from vaults and archives. Even within the church, insiders whispered that someone was cleaning up the mess, not to reveal the truth, but to erase it. At the same time, the influence of the P2 Masonic Lodge began to crumble. Its leader, Licio Gelli, was arrested in Switzerland, carrying documents that linked Italian politicians, military leaders, and Vatican financiers to illicit deals. The discovery of his membership list sent shockwaves through Italy's government, revealing a hidden network of corruption that reached from parliament to pulpits. Yet despite arrests and trials, many of the most powerful names were quietly protected. By the late 1980s, the Vatican had paid over $240 million in what it called a moral settlement, not an admission of guilt. Marcinkus eventually left Rome, living quietly in the United States until his death in 2006. Never charged, never questioned again, but the damage was eternal. For many, the Vatican's image as a moral authority was forever scarred. The faithful who once trusted the Church's purity now saw how its own bank had become a stage for greed, manipulation, and death. Behind centuries of sanctity lay a system that could rival any state in secrecy and power. And even as the scandal seemed to fade, the silence that followed spoke louder than the investigations themselves. The Vatican had survived, not because it was innocent, but because it was untouchable. The aftermath and the unseen hand. When the dust settled after the Ambrosiano scandal, the Vatican remained standing, wounded but unbroken. Its sacred walls had absorbed the storm, and its leaders moved swiftly to rewrite the narrative. Archbishop Marcinkus was quietly removed from his post in 1989, but never convicted. Inside the Vatican, new committees were formed, reforms were promised, and words like transparency began to echo through the marble corridors. But those who understood how power worked in Rome knew that reform was only a new mask for an old system. The world wanted closure, but what it got was silence. The Vatican Bank continued its operations, now under stricter watch, but still beyond the reach of any secular law. Investigations into the P2 Lodge, mafia money laundering, and Calvi's murder dragged on for decades. In 2003, 21 years after his death, a British court finally ruled that Roberto Calvi had indeed been murdered, but no one was ever convicted. The truth had been scattered across too many graves, too many sealed archives, and too many confessions that would never be made public. Yet the scandal left a permanent mark on the Church and the world. Inside the Vatican, popes that followed would quietly acknowledge the need for change. Pope John Paul II focused on restoring spiritual credibility, while Pope Benedict XVI and later Pope Francis attempted to cleanse the institution from within. Under Francis, the Vatican Bank underwent its first external audits and transparency reforms, exposing decades of financial mismanagement. But even those reforms revealed a deeper truth. Corruption was not a single event. It was a culture. The patterns that began with Banco Ambrosiano repeated themselves in different forms across continents. Offshore accounts, charity funds diverted, and political influence hidden behind the language of faith. The Vatican had built not only a spiritual empire, but a financial one that could rival states in influence and secrecy. Some historians argue that the Vatican bank scandal was never truly about money. It was about control over nations, ideologies, and truth itself. And while the names have changed, the unseen hand remains. Every time a new Vatican leak emerges, every time hidden accounts are uncovered, the shadow of 1982 returns, reminding the world that behind every holy symbol lies the same struggle between righteousness and power. The death of Roberto Calvi was not the end. It was a warning. You just witnessed one of the most shocking stories hidden behind sacred walls. A tale where faith met fortune and power silenced the truth. The Vatican bank scandal wasn't just a crime of money. It was a crime of secrecy, trust, and control. From the fall of God's banker to the shadows of P2 and the silence that followed. History reminds us that even the holiest empires can be built on fragile ground. If you made it this far, thank you. You're part of the few who seek truth, not headlines. Your support helps us bring more stories the world tried to bury. Stories of power, corruption, and the mind behind them. Subscribe to Criminal Mind Archive, where every story uncovers the darkness that shaped our world. And remember, in the search for truth, silence is never holy.